I'd like to welcome everyone to today's Office Hours webinar, Schwartz Rounds Facilitation Nuts and Bolts. During today's program, we'll take some time to talk in depth about the role of the Schwartz Rounds Facilitator, both what one does in this role and how one does it. We hope that whether you're new to Schwartz Rounds Facilitation or you've been at it for a decade, you'll find something useful to take away from this session. I'm Stephanie Adler-Yuan, Director of Training and Education at the Schwartz Center for Compassionate Healthcare, and your moderator and host for today's session. The Schwartz Center for Compassionate Healthcare, as many of you know, is the national leader in the movement to make compassion a vital element in every patient-caregiver interaction. We're pleased to offer this complimentary session to members of the Schwartz Center. Before we begin the formal presentation, let's go over a few details about the webinar. Today's program will be 60 minutes long. The first 45 minutes will be a presentation, followed by a 10-minute question and answer session. Today's program is being recorded and will be available on the Schwartz Center's member community website 2 weeks after the session. Please note that as an attendee, you're participating in listen-only mode, but you can interact with us, the presenters, by using the questions pane on your screen. This webinar is for you. So if you have any questions, please just type them into the questions pane and we'll do our best to address as many of them as possible at the end of the presentation. To give us even more information about your experience as Schwartz Rounds program leaders, we'll also introduce a few polling questions during today's program, and we hope you'll participate in these as well. Finally, as you exit the webinar, you'll receive an electronic survey about today's session. Please take a minute to complete it. We love feedback, as you can tell. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce my two wonderful colleagues who have joined us for today's webinar. Dr. Beth Lown is the Chief Medical Officer at the Schwartz Center for Compassionate Healthcare, and she's an Associate Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School as well. We don't know how she does it all. Beth will be speaking today about cultivating your practice of facilitation. Welcome, Beth.
Thank you, Stephanie.
And also with us today is Kathy Scopin. Kathy is a registered nurse, and she is our member experience advisor here at the Schwartz Center, working with our members across the US, as well as in New Zealand and Australia, to support them as they launch and develop their Schwartz Rounds programs. Kathy is here to share her expertise during our Q&A. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion.
Fantastic. So with those introductions, let's get started. Moving on to today's agenda on slide 5. So today we're dividing our presentation today into basically 2 portions. I'm going to spend some time talking first about the role of the Schwartz Rounds Facilitator. So what it means to be a Schwartz Rounds Facilitator and how you can be effective in that role, both before each of your Schwartz Rounds sessions, during Schwartz Rounds, and after your Schwartz Rounds sessions. Afterwards, Beth will be talking about cultivating your facilitation practice. So what are the characteristics and behaviors that we seek to cultivate to be effective Schwartz Rounds facilitators? And finally, as a sort of brief reminder, we're just going to point out a few of the additional resources from the Schwartz Center that are available to you as Schwartz Rounds facilitators. In case you're not sure what's out there, we want you to know that we're there to help you in lots of different ways. So with that, we will get started with the presentation and start talking about the many hats of a Schwartz Rounds facilitator. One of the things we hear all of the time when we travel the country working with our Schwartz Rounds teams is how very many different roles you need to juggle as Schwartz Rounds facilitator. So we think about juggling the host role. You're the host welcoming everyone to Schwartz Rounds. You're the conductor, making sure that the symphony of voices in your Schwartz Rounds discussions are working well together and moving toward a productive place. Sometimes you might feel like a ringmaster trying to conduct a circus of disparate voices and contingencies into one conversation. And of course, you're also a teacher and a role model, modeling what compassionate listening, compassionate care look for as you facilitate these conversations for your organization. So with that, we'll talk about, those are the hats that we wear, but what actually is the role of a Schwartz Rounds facilitator? Moving on to slide 8. And slide 9. So we're going to break it down into a few different pieces. The role of the Schwartz Rounds facilitator, as you all know, is not confined to the actual Schwartz Rounds session itself. In order to be an effective Schwartz Rounds facilitator, there's an engaging role that you'll be playing both before Schwartz Rounds sessions, of course during the Schwartz Rounds sessions, and after each Schwartz Rounds session as well. And we're going to talk a little bit today about what each of those pieces of the Schwartz Rounds facilitation job looks like. But first we're going to move on to our first polling question, because I want to hear from you. So get ready, get those fingers on the mouse. What do you consider, what do you consider the characteristic that you would most like to cultivate in yourself as a Schwartz Rounds facilitator? Are you looking to cultivate compassionate non-judgment, knowledge and management of group dynamics, non-anxious presence, comfort with silence and discomfort, or something else that we haven't thought of at all? So if that's the case, please enter that in the questions pane. Thank you all for your input. All right, we are getting lots of answers. So what we see here is that our facilitators are looking to cultivate primarily knowledge and management of group dynamics and facilitation, which is fantastic. We also see a large portion of you looking to cultivate your own comfort with silence and discomfort, because as we all know, that's something that we all need to model for participants in Schwartz Rounds, because silence and discomfort are an inevitability in our sessions. And we're also seeing that non-anxious presence and compassionate non-judgment are important to some of you as well, because if we can cultivate that presence, that's something that we'll be able to use to create the safe space that we need for a Schwartz Rounds conversation. So thank you. We'll come back to those when we talk with Beth a little bit later about how we're going to cultivate our own facilitation practice. So moving back to our presentation. We look we're moving to slide 11 to talk about how we're going to be preparing our panelists before each session. So I would argue that your role preparing for Schwartz Rounds as a facilitator, preparing your panelists for Schwartz Rounds, is at least as important as the role that you're going to play during the actual Schwartz Rounds session. One of the things that I'm asked when I train new teams, and I would bet Kathy would agree with this as well, is where do Schwartz Rounds fail? When have you seen Schwartz Rounds, fall short? And I would say that the only times, whenever I have seen, I haven't been to many terrible Schwartz Rounds, I'm happy to report, but the times that I have seen facilitators struggle have been the times that preparation has been overlooked. And so we really emphasize that as important as it is to prepare for the actual session, yourself, preparing your panelists is really key as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to think about how we are intentionally preparing our panelists with a meeting that we're going to be holding with them before the Schwartz Rounds session. And I'm sure many of you are doing this already, but I just want to go over again what we want to cover during this meeting. So we're going to be covering the purpose of Schwartz Rounds. So some of your panelists will be familiar with Schwartz Rounds and will have attended before, and some won't have. And so we want to make sure that everyone's starting from the same place, and we're reviewing why we are here in the first place, which is to give us a forum for a conversation about the social and emotional experience of caregiving as we're all experiencing it. And we want to emphasize as well that this isn't going to be putting our panelists on display for a Q&A in front of their colleagues or for a review of what they might have done right or wrong in the course of their care for a patient, but rather they're going to be offering their own experiences as a springboard for a conversation amongst their colleagues about their own experiences, right? So we want to make sure our panelists understand that. So then we're going to talk about the role of the panelists. So what the panelists are going to do during Schwartz Rounds and how they're going to do it, how long they're going to speak for, what kind of language we hope that they'll use, of course, which is feeling language, highlighting their subjective experience, first person pronouns, taking ownership of that experience. We might talk about how we use nonverbal cues to communicate with them as they're speaking during Schwartz Rounds. And I've heard great examples of this from working with facilitators all across the country. One example, one of my favorite facilitators out of a hospital in Seattle, I won't name names right now, always pounds his heart when he wants a panelist who's going sort of cognitive in their presentation to bring it back to the emotional experience. So thinking about nonverbal cues you might use to work with your panelists during the session can help them feel supported even though you're not able to speak with them while they're presenting. And finally, you just want to emphasize that you are there for them and how you're going to support them, and that if you feel that they seem uncomfortable with a question from a participant at Schwartz Rounds, that letting them know that you'll be there to support them through their experience is an important part of the preparation session. You'll want to be walking with them through the story that they're going to be sharing at Schwartz Rounds, sometimes honing that story a bit to sort of elicit the themes that you hope to discuss during the session. And of course, you'll want to be assessing their comfort level with public speaking at all. So, you know, in Schwartz Rounds, we're obviously asking a lot of our panelists when we're asking them to make themselves vulnerable, talking with their colleagues about their feelings, you know, in a public forum. But we have to remember as well that not all of our panelists will be accustomed to speaking in public at all, and we'll need to talk to them as well about what we can do to support them in that effort. And then finally, we always say that no prep session is over until all of the panelists' questions and concerns have been addressed. So, you know, we always typically let you know that it's good to leave about an hour, set about an hour aside for meeting with the panelists before Schwartz Rounds, although I'm sure that as many of you have seen, the conversations can definitely go longer than that. The goal is that your panelists feel protected and comfortable and confident moving into the Schwartz Round session and clear about what their role will be. So then moving on to the next slide, as important as it is to prepare, first I'll just share with you a few guiding principles for these conversations with panelists, which have emerged from our conversations at Facilitation workshops over the years. And those three guiding principles for these conversations are, one, that as you're discussing with your panelists what they're going to be sharing, you need to let them know that you know the patient's story. People in the room are going to hear a brief case summary. They're going to know what happened in the course of caring for this patient. We are going to want to hear at Schwartz Rounds the panelist story. So we know what happened. We want to know how it felt. And to that end, we are going to encourage our panelists to focus on speaking in the first person and using feeling words. Sometimes I feel like in healthcare, we're conditioned to use the passive voice and say, that was really sad, or the team was this. And we really need to work on shifting that language in the context of Schwartz Rounds to owning those emotions, to say something like, I felt sad. And then finally, just pointing back to this idea of making your panelists feel comfortable and safe, or helping them feel comfortable and safe. We really want to get to the heart of how can I help you tell your story? What can I do to support you as you share this experience with your colleagues? And that's great. So we're going to move on then to the next slide and talk a little bit about the hidden, I would say, the hidden agenda for the prep session, which is also to prepare yourself as a panelist for the Schwartz Rounds session. So you're going to be talking with your panelists about what they're going to be sharing, but at the same time, you're going to be developing your own game plan for the session. And that can include, as I mentioned, thinking about nonverbal cues that might be effective with your panelists, thinking about, given what themes will emerge from your panelists' stories, what are the questions or prompts that you might be using after the panelists present to transition your group to the room-wide discussion that will follow the panelist presentation. So thinking about those themes, which in a way become your learning objectives for the session as well. You want to anticipate any challenges. So if you sense that, you know, a certain panelist might feel less comfortable than the others speaking, you might want to think about strategies for helping him or her feel more comfortable. You might want to think about prompts that could help remind your panelist of the story that he or she wishes to share. And then finally, you're going to be thinking about the order of your speakers, which can move in any number of different ways. Often your speakers will be speaking in the order that they interacted with a given patient over the course of their illness. But I've also seen really effective Schwartz Rounds panels that were organized in terms of, you know, sort of lighter experiences to really more heavy emotional experiences to help your participants enter the experiences of the panelists in the course of caring for a given patient or family. So there are a number of different dynamics that might come into play, but this prep session will give you an opportunity to think about how you'd really like to frame the Schwartz Round session as you move into it. And then the day arrives, and the Schwartz Rounds is here. And I always start with the role of the facilitator coming into play with the introduction of Schwartz Rounds. Now, if you've been in a Schwartz Rounds training recently, we've given you some notes on introducing Schwartz Rounds, and if you don't have them, you can feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to provide them to you. But there are a few talking points that we like to hit on during Schwartz Rounds. The first key to setting up your Schwartz Rounds introduction is obviously to coordinate with your physician or clinical leader or a co-facilitator if you have one, just to make sure that you're both sort of organized around who is going to be saying what during your Schwartz Rounds introduction. You want to make sure that when you introduce people to Schwartz Rounds at the session, you're reviewing the purpose of Schwartz Rounds. What is Schwartz Rounds? At every Schwartz Rounds session, we see there are the regulars who are coming every time, and then we also have new members, new colleagues of panelists who are coming, some people who've heard about this Schwartz Rounds thing and want to check it out. But one of the things that we really like to emphasize as part of introducing people to Schwartz Rounds is that Schwartz Rounds is for staff. It's for you, it's for us, however you want to phrase it. Another one of my favorite facilitators out of New York City always says that to her in her introduction, that we spend so much time at Schwartz Rounds we spend so much time in healthcare talking about our patients and family stories. Now, this is a time for us to talk about and share our stories. And I think that can really set a lovely context for the Schwartz Rounds. We also ask you to introduce a bit of the story of the Schwartz Center and Ken Schwartz's story of healthcare. And one of the reasons for that is because what we're trying to do is not only contextualize your program in terms of this broader movement toward compassion in healthcare, but also to say that one man's experience has had an enormous impact and that the power of sharing our stories can change so very much. So we always provide our new teams with copies of A Patient's Story, which was Ken Schwartz's essay that started the movement that became the Schwartz Center for Compassionate Healthcare and Schwartz Rounds. And we have that on our website and are happy to send that to you as well. But we do encourage you to, in some way that you feel is your own, to share the story of the Schwartz Center as you introduce people into the experience of Schwartz Rounds. And then going to the very practical, from the sublime to the practical, we also, of course, need to cover the ground rules for participating in Schwartz Rounds. So we want to make sure that electronic devices are going to be silenced, that confidentiality about not just patient and family information, but also about what's shared at Schwartz Rounds will be respected, and that we'll be entering in this experience a space of respectful listening and safety for sharing our feelings. We also might want to introduce people to what they can expect during Schwartz Rounds, which is to say that we will be hearing from some panelists briefly, and then we'll all have an opportunity to reflect on where our panelists' experiences resonate with our own. And so setting those expectations can help to welcome new members, new participants into Schwartz Rounds. And then, of course, we'll be introducing the case or topic under discussion and the panelists themselves. And now we're going to go on to our second polling question. I'll give you all a little break from listening to me. And this one I want to ask you all very quickly. Select one of the following. Which one best describes your experience? You facilitate Schwartz Rounds alone, or you have a co-facilitator who facilitates Schwartz Rounds with you? And we chose to share this question because as we travel around talking to Schwartz Rounds teams, we are finding two things. One, that Schwartz Rounds facilitation is stressful for many of you, and we are always thinking about ways that we can help to diminish that stress and support you in your experience. And two, that many people have found that co-facilitating either with a physician leader or with another colleague can be a very, very rewarding experience. So look at this, look at these results. This is outstanding. So what we're seeing here is that only a quarter of you are facilitating Schwartz Rounds alone, and 3/4 of you are working with a co-facilitator, which I am dying to hear more about. So maybe there will be some questions about that. And just briefly before we move on, I just wanted to share a few thoughts on co-facilitation, which is a question that we get a lot in our new member trainings. So we'll be moving on to slide 16 there to share some thoughts on co-facilitation, which I think that Beth may have some more to add on when when we get to her portion of the presentation. But what I would say about co-facilitation is that it's not something to be entered into lightly, but that it can be a very supportive and, as I mentioned, rewarding experience when it goes well. Not just for you as facilitators, but also for participants in Schwartz Rounds, who obviously will benefit from hearing multiple perspectives and insights from our facilitators. So my rule of thumb for co-facilitation tends to be that if you are considering entering into a co-facilitation relationship or recruiting a co-facilitator to support you in Schwartz Rounds, to think about making sure that your partnership is planned, which is to say that you understand what role each of you is going to play, that you're both prepared, so you're both equally coming in understanding the case that will be under discussion, the goals for the session, the flow of the session, some prompts that you might be sharing, and that it's purposeful as well, so that you both have a role to play and different insights or behaviors to model for your participants, and that in general you're just coordinated and well partnered in your co-facilitation. So with that, we'll move on to continuing to discuss how we work with participants during the Schwartz Rounds. And this is just a brief reminder because Beth will go into this in more detail, but just to remind you that your role as facilitator is not just to manage the content of the Schwartz Rounds, but also the process, which is to say that we all remember, right, that the goal of Schwartz Rounds is to spend the majority of our hour together discussing and sharing our experiences, providing care. And so one of the things we try to keep an eye on is making sure that the panelist presentations really don't take more than 20 to 25 minutes before we move into the discussion portion of the Schwartz Round session. So one of your roles will be keeping time and calling on people to keep the conversation flowing and the discussion moving in a productive way. At the same time, you're going to be modeling the behaviors of compassionate caregivers as a facilitator that we are hoping to cultivate through our introduction of Schwartz Rounds into the healthcare environment and creating a better understanding of what compassion and compassionate listening can look like toward our colleagues and also, of course, by extension, toward our patients and families as well. So I will leave the during aside for now and leave that to Beth for a little bit and move on to the next slide, which covers how we wrap things up as Schwartz Rounds facilitators. So one of the things we really emphasize is that each Schwartz Round session is a bit of a journey itself. And in order for our colleagues to be able to return to their patients and to their floors feeling equipped to return to their day, to care for their patients, we really feel it very important to leave time at the end of every session to wrap it up and to quote unquote button everyone back up so that they're capable of returning to patient care. One of the things we really don't want, as we know, Schwartz Round sessions can be very emotional, and the last thing we want is for people to leave feeling worse than they arrived, right? So it's important to leave an intentional 5 minutes at the end of every session to close your session out in an intentional way. And there are a few ways to do this. One is you'll want to express gratitude to your participants, your panelists, your planning committee members, maybe highlight your planning committee members as people that staff can bring ideas for cases or topics to. You might want to highlight relevant resources for staff in case they want more information or support related to the Schwartz Rounds. So you might want to highlight pastoral care services or EAP services or wellness groups that exist within your institution that might complement the experience of Schwartz Rounds. And you might want to offer a moment for reflection or reiterate themes or discussions. Some facilitators will offer a brief guided meditation. Some will offer an inspirational quote. We've had many calls for a book of quotes or poetry to share at Schwartz Rounds, which we're trying to think about how to offer that to you. And then moving on to the next slide, another thing you might think about is just sharing some thoughts on compassion. And some of the themes that come up so often at Schwartz Rounds are around the fact that compassion is not restricted to the doctors or the nurses. It can come from anyone at any time, that we care for family members as much as we do patients, that we're really focused on thinking about our experiences with our patients as people and not as cases, thinking about how even if there are very disparate voices coming out at Schwartz Rounds, it's important to understand the perspectives and experiences of our colleagues so that we can understand their contributions as well. to think about teamwork and how we support one another, to think about self-compassion and self-care as being prerequisite for care for others, and to just accept that feelings happen, and they're a natural part of being human, and we are all human here in Schwartz Rounds. So moving on, we'll talk really briefly about debriefing Schwartz Rounds, which is the role of the facilitator after each session. And it's something that I've seen done in lots of different ways, sometimes with just a brief huddle of the planning committee after each session, and sometimes with a more extended debrief meeting with its own facilitator to discuss and evaluate how a Schwartz Round session proceeded. Some of the components that I would recommend you include in your debrief would be to make sure that you're checking in with your panelists. Even if they have to run back to their floors, someone on your planning committee can be tasked with checking in to see how the Schwartz Rounds went for them, what it was like for them, if they have any feedback or concerns. You will want to, when they're available, review the evaluations for each session and talk through how the session went and how it measured against your expectations. And you also would want to think about designating a planning committee member who might follow up with participants who seem challenged by the session. We might notice during Schwartz Rounds that certain people in the audience look like they are moved by what's being said, but they don't raise their hands and they don't have anything to say themselves, or someone might rush out suddenly at the end of Schwartz Rounds or during Schwartz Rounds. Sometimes you might even hear someone voicing a very contrary opinion, and maybe leaving abruptly. I've heard this from several sites. Following up with these individuals to let them know they're welcome and that their insights are appreciated, I think is an important way of keeping Schwartz Rounds a welcoming place for everyone at your institution. And with that, I'm going to move on to Beth's portion of our presentation here, which we're going to kick off with our last polling question, which is coming up right now. So we're going to talk about cultivating your facilitation practice. Moving into our polling question. Okay, we're going to skip this one, but I want to draw everyone's attention back to our earlier polling question where we talked about the importance of compassionate non-judgment, knowledge and management of group dynamics, non-anxious presence, comfort with silence and discomfort as components of how we facilitate Schwartz Rounds. So we talked about what we do, and now Beth, would you like to step in to talk about how we do what we do?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was really incredibly helpful. So let us go on, and we're going to skip now to slide 23. I'm going to talk about modeling some of the behaviors that we hope to see in this world. I think one of the wonderful roles that we have as Schwartz Rounds facilitators is the role of being a change agent, a tenacious and persistent voice on behalf of compassion in our healthcare settings. And we know that people learn about cultural norms, about expected behaviors by watching what other people do. And some people call this the hidden curriculum, although it's actually hidden in plain sight. But this means that we have the opportunity to model the behaviors that we would like to see, including respect, appreciation, curiosity, non-judgmental positive regard, active listening, patience, tolerance of uncertainty and complexity. These qualities and the behaviors that demonstrate them are not necessarily the norm in healthcare, as I'm sure you know. So some of the techniques that we use are listed here, and I'm going to discuss each of these and possibly even more in different sections of this webinar. First, I want to talk a little bit more about managing the flow. And one of the important tasks we have is to encourage participants to really preserve the time that we have during Schwartz Rounds, to really focus on their experiences, their emotions, their challenges, really keeping in the heart and away from problem solving or fixing. Our time in this shared space is so limited compared with all of the overwhelming amount of time we have focused on tasks. So it's easy to understand why people tend back to this way of thinking about things. And actually, I think Schwartz Rounds can be a little scary for the uninitiated. So it's easier to head into our cognitive comfort zones rather than to acknowledge our feelings and make ourselves a little bit vulnerable. Time management is another task, and I like to foreshadow the impending end of a session with a comment like, well, we have time for 1 or 2 more comments now. When there are still participants who have their hands up and who want to speak, it's helpful to respectfully acknowledge this and to say that there's always going to be more to say, and that we hope people will continue the conversation later about the themes and the issues that were raised while preserving the confidentiality of the speakers' names and the patient's issues and so forth. Now, some of you spoke about wanting to figure out how to be a little bit more comfortable. I think we need to go back 1 slide to managing silence, and that is slide 26. A lot of you wanted to think a little bit more about this in that poll that we ran. And I think this is really tricky. First of all, I think it's important to center yourself, so to take several deep breaths and to really try to train yourself to tolerate several seconds of silence. There's an old teacher's maxim that if you wait at least 3 seconds for students to respond after you ask a question, the number and the richness and the depth of responses really multiply. And I know I have found that to be true. But 3 seconds at the front of the room can really feel like a lifetime. And it can happen sometimes, especially after the panel has finished sharing their perspectives and just as you're about to open the discussion to the larger room. So I think the first strategy is to take a couple of deep breaths and count slowly to 3. And if the silence persists, it's lovely to wonder out loud what that might be about. I'll often ask a very open-ended question to get things going. I especially like to ask, what struck you as you listened to these stories? It's just a great way to begin. I have once had the experience of crickets. I mean, absolute silence and blank faces. And that has happened to me only once in about, I don't even know how many, since 2005. I've been running the Schwartz Rounds at my own hospital. And I joked at that point that I was going to have to start calling on people, and that actually seemed to break the ice and get things going. So you may have noticed that there's actually a natural narrative arc to the process of Schwartz Rounds. First, we hear stories from the panelists that may stir up our emotions, and they can stimulate these challenging inner experiences like moral distress, cognitive dissonance, anger, frustration, sadness, grief. And the first portion of a Schwartz Rounds discussion is devoted to articulating these emotions so that people know they're not alone in experiencing them. So the initial phase of Schwartz Rounds involves first building the discussion. And I think this is primarily done by asking this kind of open-ended questions, as I mentioned. And these are some that I would frequently use. What struck you? What are you feeling right now? What are your thoughts or your reactions? And then moving on to, have you had similar experiences? What resonates for you listening to these panelists speak? Once that conversation gets going, you can move towards deepening the discussion and really building a reflective space in the room. This, I think, involves a little bit more probing on your part. You might ask for some clarification if you're really uncertain about what somebody meant. And often, I find that the most frequent communication and facilitation skill that I use to move a discussion forward is reflective listening. And this is really the art of capturing the essence of what you've heard someone say and reflecting it back to them like a mirror. It's such a gift. If you offer a reflective statement and pause, it allows the speaker to go deeper into him or herself, to reflect a bit more, and to offer more. Your task is also to start collecting common themes. I think of this almost like being a qualitative researcher in some ways. You're listening carefully this entire time for overarching themes that might really capture much of what participants seem to be expressing, and you can reflect those back as well. This is what I'm hearing from the group. And then also, I think in the deepening portion of the narrative arc, it's really important to encourage differences of opinion, asking for different perspectives, because this encourages both diversity and a sense of inclusion. It sends a message that all perspectives are welcome here. So sometimes I'll just reflect back different perspectives with one perspective represented by one arm outstretched. I'll say on the one hand, we hear this, and then stretching out the other arm. On the other hand, we hear that. Who wants to dive into the middle? What do other people think here about this? Reframing also is an interesting way to run the conversation forward. Reframing a comment can be really interesting. It can turn a conversation in a different direction. So just presenting a little bit of an alternative spin on what somebody has said. What if it's all about this? Or is it possible that this could be what was happening, or this is how people were feeling? I'm going to move on to ways of responding to emotions. That's on slide 28. Now, I know that many of you have had ample experience in responding to strong emotions, even teaching people about best ways of doing this, but sometimes it can be helpful to try to articulate some potential responses. Standing nearby a participant who is visibly upset, even a kindly touch on the shoulder if you're close enough can be helpful, but I know I facilitate in a very large auditorium, and that's really not always possible. But you can reflect what you see and what you hear, and you can hold the emotions just by silence, just for a few seconds of silence before inviting someone else to speak. Recently, in one of our Schwartz rounds, a very beloved PCP, primary care doc, started to choke up, and he was reflecting on 2 recent suicides in his practice, and I just reflected that I could hear the tears in his voice as he spoke. Getting back to this thing about managing derailments, this is really tricky because it involves respectfully redirecting people. Recently, I was facilitating Schwartz Rounds, and one of our emergency department nurses started to propose a list of solutions we could implement to address some of the challenges inherent in interacting with and also treating victims of domestic violence. That was the topic. And I knew that this was a very special personal and professional interest of hers. And so I had to make a decision at that point, and I decided that I would proceed by thanking her for her comments and acknowledging her expertise and, above all, her deep commitment to this issue. And then I just asked her permission if we could set these aside for now, that because we have so little time really to share and to focus on our own experiences and feelings, I wondered if we could take these up later in another forum, and she seemed quite fine with that. We spoke about the narrative arc of Schwartz Rounds, hearing the stories, building the conversation, deepening the conversation with a turning inward, sharing our reflections, allowing for differences of perspectives. Towards the end of Schwartz Rounds, I usually like to allow about 10 minutes before the end so that we can help people move from this space of inward reflection, which can sometimes involve sadness or sense of conflict or dissonance or whatever. So we want to move from that inward space to a sense of shared community as a way of moving towards closure. So I find these kinds of questions to be quite helpful. Who do you turn to for support? How do you support each other? What have you found to be helpful for you? What strategies have you used? These questions, in my experience, really and almost invariably, they lead to a turning towards others, harnessing our personal relationships and our inner strengths to move towards closure, and it permits people to return to work feeling supported in their communities and in their shared humanity. So, thinking about fostering a Schwartz Rounds culture, I'm going to turn this back to Stephanie, and then we'll have some time for discussion of additional resources and some of your questions. So, Steph, why don't you take it from here now?
Sure, this is fantastic. We'll just forward this slide so we can get down the whole list. But one of the things that we like to think about with you know, Beth, that was wonderful. First of all, thank you. And I think what it points to for me is that what we're trying to do as facilitators in Schwartz Rounds is to create a space that can really model what we hope the broader healthcare workplace can reflect when we really embed compassion in as many of our interactions as possible, not just with our patients and families, but with each other and with ourselves. So that's what we're trying to foster at Schwartz Rounds, is we're trying to foster openness and sharing. We're trying to foster respect for and recognition of multiple perspectives, some of which might be new to us, but that's okay. We're trying to find the courage to discuss our own human reactions and vulnerabilities to this very, very challenging and often joyful work that we're doing, and to recognize that there might not always be a right or wrong answer for all of the situations we encounter. Medicine can be a very black and white discipline in many ways, but as we know, the gray areas are the toughest ones to sort of, you know, and probably where we find ourselves most often. And so looking for ways to accept the inherent complexity of clinical experiences, clinical relationships, is part of not just Schwartz Rounds, but the work we do in general. And our goal in this really is just to come together and to recognize that we're all doing our best. We're all here for a reason. We are all deserving of compassion from ourselves and from each other. And that if we can recognize that, we'll go some distance toward making our healthcare workplace a more compassionate place to be. We have one member that I often think about who told me that outside of their Schwartz Rounds, the room where they hold their Schwartz Rounds, they will they put a coat rack and invite everyone to hang their white coats so that they can all enter the room on common ground as humans, roles and responsibilities aside, which I think is a really beautiful gesture that does acknowledge our shared humanity in this work. So that brings to an end this portion of our presentation. We'll move on really briefly. I wanted to share with some of you additional resources for your teams. And before I do, I just want to emphasize that if you have any questions for me or for Beth or for Kathy, they can be big Schwartz Rounds questions, or they can be smaller ones that are specific to your team. We are very happy to answer them here today. So now we're just going to look at some of the resources available to you as Schwartz Rounds program leaders from the Schwartz Center. And some of you might be familiar with these, but in case you're not, you can consider this a little reminder. And so I want to draw everyone's attention, first of all, to the member community website, which you can access from the homepage of the Schwartz Center's website, which is theschwartzcenter.org. And some of the sort of favorite pages of our members on the community website are some wonderful facilitation training videos that walk you through some of those different components of Schwartz Rounds facilitation that I described earlier today. And those are really helpful, I think, if you're bringing a new facilitator on board, or if you're just looking to refresh your own practice against what the quote-unquote best practice looks like. I encourage you to take a look at those. We have a wonderful topics database. Some of our members will come to us and say, you know, we've been doing this for 5 years and we're not sure what to talk about next. And we are, first of all, Kathy and I are always happy to share lots of thoughts with you. But there's also a database on our website that you can search by theme and by topic or time of year, which has hundreds of possible topics for Schwartz Rounds discussion that might help jog your memory or get your committee feeling more inspired. There are some past office hours webinars that you can feel free to access on special topics around Schwartz Rounds program management. And there's an FAQ, which covers a lot of the questions, not just that we hear from you all on a daily basis, but that tend to come up in our in-person trainings as well. You will need to register for access to our member community website if you don't have it already. You can email my colleague Anna Ferrato at aferrato@theschwartzcenter.org to get the organization code you'll need to register. So that's the online resources available to you, excuse me. And then of course we also have a series of programs and events that we hope you'll engage with to support you in your roles as compassionate leaders within your organizations and as Schwartz Rounds program leaders. And those are 2 webinar series, our Compassion in Action and Office Hours webinar series. Our next Compassion in Action webinar is going to be fantastic. It's on September 26th, and it is going to be on clinician wellness with Beth's, can I say, mentor and colleague, Dr. Charlie Hatem. And so he'll be talking about clinician wellness. We hope you'll be able to join us for that one. We also offer 3 to 4 times a year, full day in-person CME accredited facilitation workshops, which are really geared toward the needs of our ongoing programs. And the idea is that these are an opportunity for you to refresh your Schwartz Rounds practice, to connect with other members, to bring your own challenges and share your expertise in Schwartz Rounds, and really just more deeply engage with our community. They're a lot of fun. Our next one is in Seattle in September, and I'm sorry to share that I think we're actually at capacity, but we do have a wait list going for that one. We are in the process of developing our schedule for facilitation workshops for 2019, and we hope to offer 4 of them around the country. Each of our members is entitled to 2 free registrations for those workshops. There's a nominal fee if you'd like to send additional team members, but we hope that if you haven't, you'll join us for that. They're a lot of fun. And then finally, we are thrilled to announce, we just very recently announced that we'll be holding our 2nd Compassion in Action conference. The first one was in June 2017 and was a lot of fun. And our next one will be September 8th through 10th, 2019 in Boston. And so if you're thinking about ways to more deeply engage with the Schwartz Center, that conference will be a 3-day gathering, completely interprofessional, focused on ways to embed compassion in our healthcare organizations and systems. The first day of the conference, fully the first day, will be devoted to the needs of our Schwartz Center members, with an extra special focus on Schwartz Rounds, innovation and program management. And then days 2 and 3 will focus more on ways that you can help to embed compassion in your healthcare organizations, and innovation that we're seeing in compassion practices in healthcare. Our last conference was very action-oriented, very workshop-oriented, and I think really inspiring to everyone who joined us. We'll have special rates for members, so we hope you'll keep an eye on our newsletters for more information about that, and for the opportunity to present as well. And then finally, your last and my favorite resource for you is your Member Experience Advisor. So Kathy and I both serve as Member Experience Advisors for our Schwartz Rounds member programs. If you don't know whose yours is, you can email one of us at sadler-human or kscopin@theschwartzcenter.org to ask us, or look on the website and you'll see. Basically, we are here for you to answer whatever questions you have at any time, to help you out with meetings, if you need help introducing your Schwartz Rounds program to new committee members, to new leaders of your organization. If you feel like you would like us to reflect with you on possible topics for your Schwartz Rounds, feel free to reach out to us by email, phone, fax, text, whatever works for you. We are here for you. And with that, I want to turn to a Q&A. We have a couple of questions that have come in. Before I jump right in, I want to invite anyone else who has a question to share it. But I think this first question that came in, I will share. I might ask Kathy to weigh in, since you've had the opportunity to listen in all this time.
Sure.
So, thanks, Kathy. So the first question I'm seeing, I'm actually going to combine 2. But this is from one of our members. We have trouble getting physicians, some people, one person says physicians, one person says nurses, off the floors to attend Schwartz Rounds. Do you have any thoughts on how we can get more of them in the room?
So actually, those are two good questions, and I think I'd like to actually break it into two questions, if I may, Stephanie.
Of course.
Okay, so first of all, in terms of, let's start with the physician question. Typically, we see that if physician providers are not able to attend Schwartz Rounds, it's typically due to three reasons. It's due to scheduling, that Schwartz Rounds are scheduled at a time where there's a conflicting meeting. Secondly, it can be due to education. They're just not aware that Schwartz Rounds actually exist and the purpose, and that Schwartz Rounds are there for them. And the third is actually the toughest of the three reasons, and that's fear of vulnerability. And there are somewhat prescriptives that we talk about for each of those. Obviously, in terms of scheduling, you can look at going ahead and altering the time of your Schwartz Round. For the second, in terms of education, it goes back to publicizing your Schwartz Round, going out and, presenting at meetings, just presenting a short amount of time, talking about the purpose of Schwartz Rounds. Again, the third one is a little bit tougher, and some ideas that we talk about in terms of attracting physicians would be doing an all-physician panel about why I went into medicine, what I love about medicine. Maybe something a little riskier would be to have an all-physician panel around the fear of vulnerability, why it's challenging to be vulnerable. So again, look at the reasons why maybe your physician providers are not coming around. See if it could be one of those three reasons, and then try some of the prescriptives that I've just discussed. So that would be what I would talk about in terms of attracting physicians to Schwartz Rounds. In terms of the second question, as far as talking about attracting nurses to come to Schwartz Rounds, I'm going to start this out, but then I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Lowndes, to Beth, to talk about. That's been something that's been a little bit more challenging in terms of being able to have nurses come off the floor for more than 30 minutes. Obviously, nurses have to remain on the floor to take care of the patients. And so we've always had some suggestions like take turns, have managers cover patients, staff up on the day of Schwartz Rounds, come on your day off. But we also have a new program that maybe Beth could just spend a couple minutes talking about.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Kathy. So we really understand that this is a challenge, that it's really tough to get away from the bedside or from the admissions or from the units or whatever. And so we are right now running a pilot of a new version, a new program, a new version of Schwartz Rounds, which is just a bit more compact and nimble, and we're calling it unit-based Schwartz Rounds. We are taking Schwartz Rounds to the point of care. And so we've actually gathered a advisory council, a committee, to help us create a protocol to innovate so that we can offer this program to you. We have had people running this program now. It requires some advanced advertising, promotion, getting people on board with this. But we're preparing the protocol. We'll have all of the resources available, a special evaluation sheet. It's also going to require a little bit of a different kind of training for Schwartz Rounds facilitators. I think that these kinds of rounds are a little bit more tricky to facilitate. We're letting them go shorter, 30 minutes, a little bit more pared down, as I mentioned, 2 panelists rather than 3 or even more. So we have the protocol outlined and mapped out and pretty much finalized, but the training, I think, is going to be critical. You should stay tuned for this information. We're planning to launch this program in 2019, and we also hope to be able to evaluate the outcomes of this program but we think that it's going to involve more buy-in from the nurse managers in the nursing council and the CNO to allow the nursing teams to take 30 minutes, get covered, and that's going to require some logistical management by the nurse managers particularly, so that they can get released to come to these rounds. But I think it's going to be a lot easier because they're shorter and they're going to be at the point of care.
Thank you both. Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Beth, for sharing that. And I was going to ask about, I was going to ask you to speak about unit-based rounds, but we got there anyway, which was great. One more question. I'm going to bounce over to you again, Kathy, if that's okay. One of our participants asked if we have any thoughts on an evening Schwartz rounds for night shift workers.
Absolutely. This question comes up a lot when I'm doing training, and my suggestion is to look at, first of all, look at kind of your room locations, but during the year, go ahead and try cycling or kind of rotating the time of your Schwartz rounds in order that those areas that can't make it to your general large forum round, that they have the opportunity. So again, kind of play with that, and so that other times have, again, the opportunity. And I think, again, that unit-based Schwartz rounds may also be maybe kind of the remedy if that does not work, if you don't have good turnout, if you go ahead and try doing, having your rounds at a different time during the day.
Fantastic, thank you. And just can I do an add-on to that question, or do we not have time for anything else? We have 2 minutes. Really quickly, one more question from our participants. How do you feel about, we've never had a patient or family member participant. How do you feel about including them as panelists in Schwartz rounds?
Do you want me to?
Oh, sorry.
Do you want me to?
Yeah, sure, Beth. Why don't you weigh in on that?
I'm going to be honest, I have mixed feelings about it. We have done that. I think those have been pretty powerful, but one thing that I noticed is that when there is a patient or a family member in the room, people are much more guarded about expressing their feelings. And I take this as a sign of the good hearts of the people who attend the Schwartz rounds, that they wind up feeling the need to protect that person, to support that person. They fall more into their professional roles, and they have less of an opportunity to really participate from their own hearts. So it does shift the focus a little bit. So it's not to say don't do it. We have done it on more than one occasion, and I think those can be very powerful. Just be mindful of what some of the consequences can be, and you need to really prepare for that.
Yeah, that's well stated. I usually advise people that it won't necessarily be the rounds that you expect, but it will be a valuable experience for everyone present. So it's something, as you said, to be entered into with preparation and mindfully. And that, I think that's all we have time for today. I want to thank everyone for participating in our webinar today. I would really like to thank Beth and Kathy for sharing your experiences and insights with us today as well. And I really hope that everyone found today's session helpful and will join us for future office hours sessions as well. Finally, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, as busy as all of you are, we hope you'll take just a minute to complete the survey to give us some feedback on this session as you exit the webinar, because we really appreciate and treasure your input. So thank you everyone for all the work that you do to support compassion in healthcare, and have a wonderful day.